So thanks for the introduction. That's a very warm and flattering introduction. When I was invited to come to speak at Penryn, I kind of had to say yes, because the previous 2 times that I was invited, I was overseas and I couldn't come, but I've really wanted to come and speak at Penryn, because a lot of the people that I've spoken to that have either taught here or been involved with PenReach particularly have kind of built it up to be a very big thing, and I thought to myself, I definitely want to come and see it, which I did today, and I have been very impressed. The other reason why it's helpful to come to Mpumalanga from Cape Town is you can take long showers. So I like to think in the shower, and so the drought is not just a natural problem in Cape Town, it's also affecting my intellectual life. Because I can't take these long showers and think about things and whatever. Anyway, so you find ways of getting around it. But the discussion that I wanted to have today, the broad title, and if you can't see the screens, I'd shuffle in, because a lot of what I'm going to be saying is going to be on the screens. The title of the presentation was, what should we be focusing on for the next 10 years? And originally, I'd wanted to focus on reading and early grade reading, because I think that's become basically almost all of what I do with my life now, because I've been totally convinced that if we don't get the early years right, it's all downhill from there. But decided not to focus on reading, and instead to focus on inequality. And the presentation that I want to give today is a slightly different one to the one that I normally give, which is very heavy on kind of the education data in South Africa and what we understand from education data and what we can do about it. Whereas today, I also want to speak partly about the moral issue of inequality in South Africa. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first one is because having been exposed to the fees must fall discussion and the types of students, the types of arguments that they've been making around fees must fall, the first one is I think that we're running out of time to address extreme inequality in South Africa. And the second one is that I think that unless we have a shared and common understanding of the problem and the depth of the problem, in other words, if we have a shared understanding of the diagnosis of the problem in South Africa, we might balk at what we think are the prescriptions and the prognosis. So what needs to change? What are we willing to sacrifice to make the changes that need to happen? So those are the 2 reasons why I wanted to focus on inequality. But first, a little bit of data. So I think this is apt to have this conversation at a school like Penryn, and I think that everyone in the audience, by virtue of being in the types of circles that we're in, to be invited to events like this, has been exposed at some point to a functional school, a very good school, a very well-resourced school like Penryn. But that's not all schools. So of the roughly 25,000 public schools in South Africa, 14% do not have electricity. 10% of schools have no water supply. Now, this is the one that really hit me, because I thought, what the heck do you do when, you can't wash your hands, you can't make tea, you can't do anything without water? And that number, just to give you an example, that 2,402 public schools in South Africa that don't have water, that's more than the total number of schools in the whole of Mpumalanga. There are fewer than 2,402 schools in Mpumalanga. So if you think of that number of schools, if every single one of them did not have water, that's how many schools in South Africa don't have water and are scattered around the country, and also concentrated in rural areas and poorer provinces. The the last 2 that I wanted to mention here were about ablution facilities. And in the introduction, you mentioned that I get angry when I see certain types of toilets, and I try and make a point of going to the toilet, or at least looking at the toilet in whatever schools I visit, which is not a great strategy to have if you're going to really bad schools. But about 4% of schools have no ablution facilities whatsoever, and about half use pit latrines. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of Michael Komape. This is a story in 2014. It's a 6-year-old student. During his first week of school, at a school just outside Polokwane in Limpopo. He went to a toilet, sat on a piece of corrugated iron, fell into the toilet and drowned. A 6-year-old child. He's in one of almost half of South African public schools that have pit latrines. And the parents, when they tried to get involved and tried to come to the school and wanted to, they didn't know where their child was when they came to the school. The school said, there's no ways that he's here. The mother even said, I would like to check the toilets. And they said, you can't. He's definitely not here. At which point he may have still been alive. But the point I want to make about inequality, and particularly this horrific story about a child drowning in a pit latrine, is that in the same country that we have a child drowning in a pit latrine, we have a school that charges 220,000 Rand a year fees. Same school has the largest school premises in the Southern Hemisphere. It has 4 natural waterfalls occurring on its premises. So this is when everyone goes, okay, so it's not Penryn. It's not Penryn, it's Hilton College, if you didn't put the pieces together. But the point is, it's particularly striking, not just that we have this type of infrastructure problem, because there are other countries that have this type of infrastructure problem. The really striking thing here is that somehow in South Africa, we are okay with coexisting with this, children drowning in pit latrines, and schools that have a true abundance of resources, any kind of resource you can think of, coexisting in the same space. So this is a picture, it's from KZN, of a golf course with shacks, people living in shacks right next to the golf course. It's from drone footage to highlight inequality in South Africa. So there's some great photography that's come out of this. Just trying to visualize what inequality looks like in South Africa. And this is something I'm going to talk about quite a lot in this presentation, is a notion of a shared future. This notion that we're all in this together. So when we started, when nation states first came about, when people got together and we defined a kind of a country rather than a clan or a group of people, a lot of that was because there was a feeling that there was a shared future amongst the people in those borders, which is why they were willing to be taxed, why they were willing to be conscripted into the army, was there was some sense that we're all in this together. This is also an interesting time. It's 70 years, it's the 70-year anniversary to partition in India, where India and Pakistan split and created 2 separate countries. And what struck me watching a movie and reading articles about this that are coming up on my newsfeed is that at some point in the Indian kind of trajectory, when they were moving towards partition, this notion of Hindus and Muslims in in India having a shared future, a common future, started to crumble. And for Muslims, the future was in Pakistan, in Muslim Pakistan. For Hindus in India, it was going to be in Hindu India. And at some point, there was a break where people now decided, we no longer have a shared future. Our future is in Pakistan, our future is in India, and there was partition. And there are lots of also other economic and political reasons as well. But it really hit home for me in South Africa, this idea of a shared future. And I think I started asking myself, attending schools like Penryn and Model C schools and independent schools, etc., but then also attending very, very dysfunctional, extremely deprived schools, and asking myself, do we have a shared future in South Africa between the rich and the poor, or not? A recent story, this is one of the reasons which hit me about inequality. I went to a shopping center to buy food, and I just walked around. I wasn't looking at the prices. I was just like, these are the things that I need. Put it into the basket, bought it. I think I even bought a Magnum that I was eating on the way home. And as I was walking home, there was a homeless person digging out of a bin and sorting as well, and selecting some things. This is a half-eaten can of yogurt. This is empty, a little bit left of Coke, taking it. And as I walked past, eating this 20 Rand Magnum, or however much Magnums cost, it struck me that for me, I go to a shopping center and I just select whatever I want. But for him, within 25 meters, he's now selecting what he wants out of a rubbish bin. And I thought to myself, this is so messed up. That I'm somehow fine with this, that I've not necessarily inherited money, but inherited lots of forms of privilege through the education that I've had, the opportunities that I've had, the parents that I've had, etc. So the question I'm going to keep coming back to is whether or not we have a shared future in South Africa. So, some statistics on South African society. This is from a new paper published by some very well-renowned economists at UCT, looking at the National Income Dynamics Study surveys. And what they found was, if you classify South African society into one of those 5 groups, the chronic poor, the transient poor, the vulnerable, the middle class, and the elite, where the chronic poor are living on 390 Rand a day or less. A month or less. So each person in the household, if there's only one person in the household, they have 390 Rand to live on for that month. Compared to in the elite, each person in the household will have 19,000 odd Rand to spend. Okay? And if we think in those 5 groups, if you had to guess, which I'm not going to test you on, what percentage of South African society falls into each of those groups? And you might even ask yourself, where am I there? What income does my joint household have? Do your mental calculation and figure out where you are there. One of the things which a lot of South Africans, particularly those that are in those last 2 groups, don't realize is that about half of South African society are chronically poor. So living on less than 390 Rand per month, so roughly 10 Rand a day. A further 13% are transient poor. In other words, depending on the period at which you look at them, they're either in poverty or not in extreme poverty. There's a vulnerable group, a further 14%. These are people who are not in poverty, but are subject to shocks. So if any kind of shock happens to them, they get plunged back into poverty. There's a further group who are middle class, 20%, which means that only 4% of the population are classified as elite. In other words, they're spending more than 19,000 Rand per person. Okay? So this is the South African society that we have. I mean, I can show you, and I will show you later, how this maps onto an education system that we have. But what happens if we say, okay, we know that South Africa is really unequal, but we also know that South Africa is very racially unequal. So what does those categories look like if we break them down by race? So this is the racial composition of those different classes. So amongst the chronic poor, Black Africans make up 95% of that group. Together with the vulnerable and transient, we're talking about 90% of those groups are Black African. If we then add colored and Indian, what I think is going to be quite obvious is that if you look at the elite section, 2/3 of the elite in South Africa is still white. And 1/3 of the middle class is white. Okay? Now, this is, again, coming back to the question of, do we have a shared future in South Africa? Does that top group, black and white, share any sense of a future affected by any of the same things as the 50% of the population at the bottom, the chronic poor? And broadly speaking, although in this particular paper they identified the elite, typically those top two are collapsed together, which is often why the racial kind of element of that 65% isn't foregrounded. But if you take those top 2 categories together, they have very, 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 very little in common with the rest of South African society. The schools they attend, the healthcare that they have, the opportunities in life that they have access to, all of these are very, very different. But that's talking about income. What happens if we talk about wealth? So in South Africa, using tax data, so SARS data, it's pretty legit, much more legit than survey data, because people lie in surveys and they're dogs that prevent people coming across fences, etc. It's a major problem in measuring the income of the rich. It's called the problem of the dogs. And in South Africa, this is also a massive problem, so that surveys always underestimate how rich the rich are because there's so few of them in the sample, because they just say, no, you can't come in. So 10% of South Africa's population owns 95% of the wealth in South Africa. Okay, so that category name should be 95% owned by the wealthiest 10% of the population. So 10% of South Africans own 95%. which means that the remaining 90% own the remaining 5%. This is using tax data. So this has got to do with assets, it's got to do with houses, it's got to do with property, it's got to do with shares, it's got to do with various things. Again, we need to ask ourselves the question, do those 9 humans, represented men and women in South Africa, have a shared future with that one at the bottom, the 10%? Do they have anything in common between them, apart from living in the same geographical boundary? Now this is particularly extreme, wealth inequality, even by international standards. But one of the things that makes inequality particularly severe in South Africa is not just the level of the inequality, but the nature, the pattern of the inequality. And that's what we saw with the racial dynamics of the elite still being 2/3 white. This is very difficult to find in any other country. Not Brazil, not the US. These are not kind of orders of magnitude different to those countries. This is just the reference if you want to read the study. So I've put a quote here which I really, really like, and I'm going to come back to a number of times in the talk, where Thomas Piketty, who's done a lot of work on inequality, he says, inequality in every country needs to be justified. You need to tell a story about why this level of inequality is acceptable or unacceptable. And the question I want to ask today is whether or not the story that we're telling ourselves, personally, me shopping at Spar and walking past the person who's digging in a rubbish bin, but also collectively as a South African society, is the story that we're telling ourselves about the levels of inequality that we've just seen, does it still hold water? Or is it wearing thin? And if it's wearing thin for us, you can imagine it's wearing thin for people that are not benefiting, for the poorest 50% of the population. And this is where I want to use some tangible examples, because I think this is the most recent example of how a moral question, like inequality, has translated into quite radical political action and then change of budgets. And at the moment, it seems to have died down a little bit, but I don't think that the underlying cause has disappeared. And that's the fees must fall issue, which I think everyone is aware of. So the reason why I say that this is a moral question is, at its root, what fees must fall is about is that academically deserving students were being excluded for the only reason that their parents could not pay their fees. And what we're going to see is these were a very, very select group of students that actually made it past the millions of hurdles that were put in their path as poor South Africans to get to this point, to then be told, you can't pay, go away. Which I think all of us find morally repugnant. Okay? But let's put this in perspective, the entire fees must fall issue. This is a study that we did at Stellenbosch where we followed all of the 2008 matriculants. So every single person that wrote matric in 2008, we followed them for 6 years into higher education. Every single university, no matter where they went in South Africa. So if we start out with 100 students that start school, only 60 of them will write matric, and we know that that's due to dropout in South Africa, particularly grade 10 and grade 11 dropout. Of those 100 that started school and 60 that wrote matric, 37 will pass matric, but importantly, only 12 will access university. So of 100 kids that started school, only 12 access university, but what is most striking, 6 complete an undergraduate qualification, and only 4 complete an undergraduate degree of the starting 100. So less than 5% of a cohort is going to university and getting a degree within 6 years of finishing matric. A small percentage get added on if you extend the period for longer than 6 years. So the entire fees must fall discussion that we're having, which part of this diagram is it representative of? It's definitely not the 100 that started school, the 60 that wrote matric, or the 37 that passed matric. If we look at, this is a graph of income deciles, so on the left that's the poorest 10%, and on the right that's the wealthiest 10% of South African. And what we can see by the red bars, those are the percentage of that starting cohort, that group, that qualified to go to university and also went. The dark grey bars is those that qualified but didn't go, and the light grey bars are those that did not qualify to go to university. And what can we see? Basically that the vast majority here, this light grey section, never qualified in the first place. Right? So higher education is just totally not part of the picture for their lives. The reason why the fees must fall discussion is really important is if you take these red sections here, exempt and attending, in other words, they qualified to go to university and attended university, these are the students that we're talking about that are saying, we've passed so many hurdles, many of those hurdles I'm going to show you in a bit, and now we're told you must go because you cannot pay. And your parents cannot pay, who are unemployed. So the question that we've got to ask ourselves is what this translates into a labor market. What does it look like when we get to a labor market? But before we do that, I want to show you, again, on a racial dimension, the percentage of that 2008 cohort that got degrees by race. Okay? This is for a paper that I did on gender, so you're going to see it split between males and females. But the striking point, if we look at men, only 3% of male black matriculants go on to get an undergraduate degree, compared to 23% of white male matriculants. Okay? So if you can think of that as if you have a class of 33 and they are all black males, only of matriculants, only one of them will go on to get an undergraduate degree, compared to every fourth child amongst white males. If we look at females, and the point of this particular slide, but I'm not going to dwell on it, is that females do way better than males at school and at university, which is a very interesting finding. And an underappreciated one, which is why we wrote a 60-page paper about it. You can hear from the audience, I'm telling you. But what we can see is that, firstly, the obvious one is that females within every race group do better than males. But the point I want to try and want to show here is, if you look at white females, 33% of white females in matric are getting an undergraduate qualification, compared to 3% of black males. So if there was a representative matric classroom of South Africa, and we opened the door and we went in, and there was a white female, there was a black male, we would be able to say this white female has 10 times likelihood of getting an undergraduate degree compared to this black male. Is 10 times more likely to get an undergraduate degree compared to a black male. Now, of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with race in itself as a construct. And it has everything to do with the quality of schooling, the early childhood development experiences, nutrition, all sorts of things, life chances, parental education, that people have either been given access to and therefore have privilege, or been denied and therefore have disadvantage. But again, I want to ask the same question. Does this person and this person have a shared future in South Africa? But this is higher education, right? What about schooling? So what happens if we're not looking at that group over there that access university, but we look at those that actually start school? We look at the full cohort instead of just those that access university. And the reason why I mention that is I think that the moral logic behind fees must fall, that academically deserving students shouldn't be denied higher education because they can't pay fees, the exact same moral logic is applicable at the schooling level. And in a sense, every single student is academically deserving when they enter school, right? And every single student should be given the opportunity to learn, to read for meaning and pleasure. And yet what we're saying here is, unless you can pay fees, as you're going to see, that opportunity is denied you. So that's why I say I think that schooling is a hop, skip, and a jump away from the fees must fall logic. When I was in Grahamstown earlier in the year, I was at St. Andrews, and I was just thinking there was all this protest action that was happening at Rhodes, which is really close to St. Andrews, and I'm just thinking, in my mind, this is literally like 150 meters between people protesting and burning rubbish and doing all sorts of major political action there, but schooling is this total silent kind of island that's not being currently yet disturbed. So this is a Zapiro cartoon where there's a child and she says, I miss the textbook crisis. And she's at a school in Vuwani that's been burnt down, and there's current talk again that there's going to be disruptions in Vuwani. So let me tell you a little bit about reading. And as I say, this is something which I'm particularly passionate about. If we look at the poorest 10%, which is on the right, and the richest 10%, which is on the left, and we ask what percentage of South African grade 4 children learn to read for meaning in any language. So this test was done in all of the 11 languages, depending on whatever the lot of the school was. Okay? The reason why grade 4 was tested, and this was from a study called the Pre-Pearls, is, and I hope we have some foundation phase teachers in the audience, I think they're like the most valuable citizens of the country, is grades 1 to 3 are the learning to read phase, grades 4 onwards are the reading to learn phase. Okay, so if you haven't learned to read in the first 3 years of school, you're just perpetually behind for the rest of schooling. It's all downhill. So if we look, the percentage of South African grade 4 children that can read for meaning, what happens in the richest 10%? 87% of grade 4s amongst the richest 10% learn to read for meaning by the end of grade 4. So the vast, vast, vast majority. What about the second richest 10%? Only 58%. Third richest, only half. So now only every second grade 4 child is learning to read for meaning. And in the poorest 70%, basically 1 in 3. And this is in the language that they are most familiar with. Okay? So in the poorest, it's as an easy way to remember this. A lot of my students say, oh, we battle to remember statistics. So we find mnemonics to remember it. In the poorest 2/3 of the population, 2/3 do not learn to read for meaning. If there are 3 kids, 2 of them are not going to learn to read for meaning, and only the third will. In the poorest 70% of the population, 1 in 3 will learn to read for meaning. But this is really difficult to grasp, right? For those that aren't on the ground looking at kids that are trying to read and battling to read, it's really difficult to grasp. So I've taken a study. This is a story. This is a grade 5 test. So by grade 5, more than 90% of kids are learning in English. And the story is a traditional story, how leopard got his spots. And we can see the story goes like this. And what I'm going to show you, the text is quite small, but hopefully you can still see some of it. The younger members of the audience, maybe. What I'm going to show you is what the recommended rate of reading those first 2 sentences is at the top, and what the reading rate looks like for those types of students that cannot read for meaning. So this is students that are reading at 40 words correct per minute or lower. In this case, it's 40 words correct per minute, which is almost half of our rural students, okay, in rural areas, based on the study. This is what it looks like. The first read is finished reading. And now the second read is finished. So now I don't show this to make you feel awkward for a minute. It's to emphasize the point that this is not just a minute for half of South Africa's rural children. This is every single day. Their interaction with text is like that. How do you read for meaning or for pleasure or for anything when that's how quickly you can read? When that's your level of decoding, of fluency, of comprehension, etc. It's not possible. And again, I'll ask you the question, does that student and the type of school that that student attends have a shared future in South Africa with the 50% of rural students that are reading like that? So, how does this very unequal schooling system and very unequal society interact with each other, the schooling system and the labor market? Basically, again, even smaller. You start with a very unequal society, about 80% of the population that have low socioeconomic status. They attend very low-quality early childhood development. They attend low-quality primary schools and low-quality secondary schools. This is in contrast to a very small minority, about 15 to 20% of South African society, that attend high-quality early childhood development that's socially, emotionally, cognitively stimulating. They attend fee-charging primary schools and fee-charging secondary schools that are of a relatively high quality, and they go on to some kind of further education and training, whether university or a kind of technicon FET college. Now, there is some movement from that part of the system to this part of the system, exceedingly small, less than 5%. Now, if this is what the schooling system looks like, what does it feed into? It feeds into a labor market that looks like this. Only 15% of South Africans in the labor market are in what we would call high-pay, high-status professional jobs. A further third are in semi-skilled jobs. About 20% are in unskilled jobs like domestic work, which is that layer over there, and 35% are unemployed, using the broad definition. Amongst youth, the broad definition of unemployment is 50%. So every second youth is unemployed in South Africa, 18 to 26-year-olds. Now, the big question is, if you, and you are most likely, if your parents on this part of the labor market, where do they send their children? To that part of the schooling system. If your parents are on this part of the labor market, where do they send their children? To that part of the schooling system. And you have these two systems that are perpetuating each other to the extent that we have higher levels of inequality today than we did in 1994. Okay? In some ways, it's a very different kind of inequality. In other ways, it's very similar. So within race, inequality has ballooned since 1994. Particularly amongst black Africans. The fact that there's now not a homogenous group of poor black Africans that, as it was under apartheid, there's now a black middle class and part of an elite. That means that by construction there's going to be more inequality. But again, I want to ask you the question, is there a shared future here and here? I'm not so sure. So the prospect I want to put to you is that attending a fee-charging school is like the railway switch in South African society. This is the thing that flicks you one way or the other. I can't think of a single thing that is more deterministic of your life chances, whether poor or rich, than attending a functional school. And in South Africa, that means attending a fee-charging. 95% of the time, it means attending a fee-charging and often relatively high fee-charging school. So again, we come back to the quote from Piketty. Inequality in every country needs to be justified. You need to tell a story about why this level of inequality that we have in South Africa is acceptable or unacceptable. And given South Africa's history, I think we need to go one step further and not just say this level of inequality, but because things are improving in South Africa, both in the education system. The TIMSS results show that maths and science outcomes, although still dire, have improved. There are more high-level black maths and science passes in matric. There are various kind of positive metrics. So the question is not so much is the level, but it's the rate of progress. Is the rate of progress that we have in South Africa sufficient, and the story that we tell ourselves around that rate of progress, for us to be happy? So I think to kind of round this off, there's probably about one or two more slides. Some questions that I have, and things that I want to put out into the Q&A session. Firstly, I think that there's a much greater sense of urgency. We need a much greater sense of urgency than what we currently have. And I do think that we're running out of time. It's one thing to do a fees must fall type situation where they are now, during peak protest time, have to negotiate as if they have a gun to their heads. And I said to some people earlier today as well that it's much easier to try and fix the problem when you're not in a crisis. When you don't have where you don't have students that are currently attending totally dysfunctional schools, shutting down Penryn and coming on your campus and preventing teaching and learning happening in a type of fees must fall logic. It's very difficult to negotiate and come up with solutions then as it is compared to in times of relative peace that we have now. Secondly, I think that we need a much greater willingness to share limited resources, very low economic growth, 0.5% or lower. Doesn't look like it's going to change, unless there's quite a big political change in 2019. And that we need to move into a more pro-poor way, both in a legislated fashion, but also in a voluntary fashion. People that have positions of privilege and power, like all of us in this room, need to be doing a lot more than we're currently doing and moving out of our comfort zones if we're to address this problem before it does run out of time. And the third one is we have to find bolder ways of expanding access to quality education for the poor. And that involves two things. The first one is increased access to the functional fee charging roughly 15% of schools like Penryn for poor students that can pay no fees. There need to be ways of ensuring that more students like that get opportunities to attend schools like this. Very difficult to do. It needs to happen. The second one is that we need to improve the quality of learning outcomes in that poorest 85% of schools, in the dysfunctional, largely no-fee sector. And just to kind of try and make sure that it's not all doom and gloom, I do want to mention two things briefly about that second one, which is two examples of ways that we can improve learning outcomes amongst, and particularly in reading, amongst the poorest, in the poorest schools. The first is something called the Early Grade Reading Study, which was done in the Northwest Province. And interestingly, Mpumalanga, apart from being a good place to come and shower, is also having the EGRS2, so the follow-up to the study is happening in Mpumalanga in a lot of schools. So that's a very, very, very exciting and interesting thing. The Northwest and Mpumalanga are the only two provinces where this is happening. So what this study did was it did something called a randomized control trial, which is the same way that we test if medicines work, where one group, you allocate some schools to getting a certain treatment and other schools to getting another, but because you're randomly allocating which schools get and which schools don't, you can be sure if there's a difference at 2 years later, it was because of the intervention. Which is unlike if you just pick a school and do an intervention, you don't actually know if it works. Here, we can be very sure we know whether it works or not. They tested these 4 different types of interventions. 80 schools got nothing, business as usual, centralized training, a coach, and parent involvement. What did they find? So this is just a map showing you which schools got the treatment and which schools didn't. What they found was that basically only the coaching arm had an intervention, but it had a very large impact. So a coach visiting a poor school, these were all quintile 1 to 3 Setswana medium schools, a coach visiting and helping a teacher with books, with resources, with graded readers, etc., increased the amount of learning that happened with the kids that that teacher taught by 40% of a year of learning within 2 years. Okay? A coach visiting teachers once a month is quite expensive, but this is a type of intervention that does lead to, it is scalable, and they show it is scalable, and this is the National Department of Basic Education that's driving this, by the way, not private funders only. There are private funders on board and various other people. The second one is something which I'm working on now, which is saying, great, if we know that the comprehension outcomes, if we know that 2/3 of kids in the poorest 2/3 of school can't read for meaning. In other words, the comprehension outcome is bad. That's the tip of the iceberg. There are a whole bunch of components of reading, which you can't see there, being able to decode the vocabulary that you have, whether or not you have access to books and text in a print-rich environment. Do you have the requisite skills to learn to read and an environment that you can learn to read? And that's the majority of the iceberg, and that's something that we're trying to address. So these are the different components of reading, which anyone familiar with reading will recognize them. But it's a project called the Funda Wande project, which aims to address teachers, the fact that the majority of teachers in poor schools actually don't know how to teach reading. They don't have the content knowledge of the types of activities you need to do and the resources that you need to teach any kid to read in any language. There are language-specific differences, but the point is there is shared content knowledge which is not being given to the poorest 80% of schools. And we think that this is a really important thing that is being tested and rolled out. So the very last thing I want to leave you with, this is a quote which I'm going to read out to you, is in relation to, I think, the inequality that we've been discussing, the education inequality, the justice of it, but also realizing that this is not just a random country. South Africa is not a random country that has inequality like many other countries. All countries have a history. And our particular brand of history is apartheid. Before that, colonialism, but particularly apartheid. The distribution of who gets what now and who has what now is heavily, heavily influenced by who got what under apartheid. It's not something that changed at 1994, and I think this is something that we need to be addressing. So this is something which I've called "No Peace Without Justice." It's a quote from Amos Wilson. It's actually quite nice that you can't read it now, because I can read it to you. So, he says, "Justice requires not only the ceasing and desisting of injustice, but also requires either punishment or reparation for injuries and damages inflicted for prior wrongdoing. The essence of justice is the redistribution of gains earned through the perpetration of injustice. If restitution is not made and reparations not instituted to compensate for prior injustices, those injustices are in effect rewarded. And the benefits such rewards conferred on the perpetrators of injustice will continue to draw interest, to be reinvested, and to be passed on to their children. Consequently, injustice and inequality will be maintained across the generations, as will their deleterious social, economic, and political outcomes." The question I want to leave you with is whether or not we as a society, we as individuals, the people that we interact with, do we in South Africa have a shared future with the vast majority of South Africans? Thanks.